It was the hottest day of the summer. In the quiet town of Maplewood, New Jersey, the air lay heavy and unmoving. Heat shimmered off the pavement, and the branches of the maple trees hung limp in protest. Inside the town's public library, where the dusty scent of old books clung to every corner, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional whisper of turning pages or the low hum of a ceiling fan struggling to do its job. Sarah Bennett adjusted the gray woolen scarf around her neck, dabbing at the beads of sweat forming along her hairline. The scarf, though completely inappropriate for the sweltering weather, never left her body. It had become as much a part of her as her voice used to be, before everything changed. She stood alone in the non-fiction aisle, her fingers brushing along the spines of old encyclopedias, her posture elegant, yet weary. To the casual observer, Sarah appeared composed. Her small frame, neat cardigan, and delicate features gave her an air of thoughtful gentleness. She'd worked at this library for 5 years, keeping mostly to herself. Patrons knew her as the quiet one with the scarf. Nobody ever asked why she wore it, and Sarah never volunteered the truth. She paused near the health and medicine section, her eyes landing on a thick, outdated book titled Understanding the Thyroid. Her hand hovered there for a moment, before quickly pulling away. Not today. The door to the library opened with a soft chime. A young boy, no older than 10, entered and gave Sarah a cheerful wave. She returned it with a tired smile. "Hey, Miss Bennett. I'm here for the summer reading thing," he said, holding up a dog-eared flyer. "Welcome back, Micah," she replied, her voice low but warm. "Go ahead and sign in at the desk." He skipped over to the front, and Sarah leaned on one of the shelves for a second. Her breath caught. Not pain, yet, but a tightness, as if her throat were being compressed by invisible hands. She glanced at the clock. Just a few more hours. The day wore on. The heat grew heavier, the fans louder, and Sarah's steps slower. She offered Micah a popsicle from the staff freezer before he left, and watched him bounce out the front door with cherry-red lips and sticky fingers. As she walked back toward the reference section, her vision blurred for a second. She gripped a shelf, willing herself to focus. The lights overhead flickered briefly, perhaps from the air conditioning straining on high. Her head throbbed and she blinked hard, and then it happened. Her knees buckled. The book she held tumbled to the floor. Her vision spun in wild circles before going dark around the edges. She heard a faint gasp, the small voice of Micah, who had unexpectedly turned back to ask about a book he'd forgotten. "Miss Bennett?" His shout echoed through the empty library. The next sounds were the clatter of books, the pounding of small feet, and the shrill ring of the emergency call button being pressed. Moments later, the building buzzed with movement. Staff arriving, voices raised, footsteps rushing. Sarah lay unconscious on the wooden floor, one arm twisted beneath her, the other across her chest. Her scarf remained in place, tight and unmoving. When the paramedics arrived, one of them frowned. What the hell is she doing with a scarf like that in this heat? They tried to rouse her. Her pulse was weak, breathing shallow. A rasping sound came from her throat, like air being pulled through a straw that was nearly pinched shut. "She's in respiratory distress. Let's get her on oxygen. Stat." They hoisted her onto a stretcher, and just as they were wheeling her out the library doors, Micah stood to the side, his eyes wide and frightened. "What happened to her?" he asked one of the staff. A woman shook her head. "Nobody knows. She's always been quiet, always wore that scarf. Even in the dead of summer." Micah watched as the ambulance drove away, sirens fading into the heat haze. But the image stuck in his mind, the pale woman with the scarf, collapsing in a place that had always felt safe. And though he didn't understand why, he knew something wasn't right. Back inside the library, in the corner where Sarah had fallen, her reading glasses still lay on the floor beside the copy of Understanding the Thyroid, open to a chapter titled Signs You Shouldn't Ignore. Sarah's first memory of her mother was the sound of her voice, soft, confident, always singing. Their house had been small, tucked between rows of other modest homes in rural Pennsylvania, but it had always felt big because her mother filled it with music. Hymns in the morning, jazz in the afternoon, lullabies at night. Even on hard days, when the fridge was almost empty or when bills arrived with red stamps on the envelope, her mother sang. "You don't run from fear, Sarah," she used to say. "You sing over it." And Sarah believed her. Her father had walked out before she turned 2, leaving behind only his last name and a photo album no one looked at anymore. It had always been just Sarah and her mother. They made it work. Her mother cleaned houses, worked in diners, and still found time to teach Sarah piano. Every Sunday, the two of them sang at church together, Sarah's voice high and pure, her mother's warm and steady underneath. When Sarah was 16, her mother started coughing. At first it was nothing, a dry tickle, a raspy laugh, brushed off with a wave of the hand. But soon, there were other signs: weight loss, fatigue, a tremor in her hands. Sarah noticed a swelling in her mother's neck one day when they were brushing teeth together, a small bump, barely noticeable, just above the collarbone. "What's that?" Sarah asked. Her mother pulled her scarf tighter, an old floral thing she wore when it got cold. "Nothing," she said, "just age catching up to me." Sarah didn't push, but the coughing got worse. By the time they saw a doctor, after a month of rescheduled appointments and missed work, it was too late. The diagnosis came hard and fast: aggressive thyroid cancer, likely spreading, possibly terminal. Sarah sat beside her mother in the doctor's office when the word biopsy was said. She watched her mother's face tighten, not in fear, but defiance. "No," her mother said, voice steady. "I don't want surgery." The doctor blinked. "Ma'am, with your current condition." "I said no." That night, Sarah cried for hours. Her mother sat beside her on the couch, rubbing her back like she used to when Sarah had nightmares. "I'm not afraid of dying," she whispered. "I'm afraid of hospitals. Of being poked and prodded until there's nothing left of me but wires and beeping machines." "You don't have to be afraid," Sarah whispered back. "We'll do it together. I'll be with you." Eventually, her mother agreed. Sarah scheduled the surgery. They never made it that far. The morning of the procedure, her mother collapsed in the hospital waiting room before pre-op. They rushed her into the ER. Sarah wasn't allowed inside. When the doors opened again, a nurse walked toward her, eyes filled with something unreadable. "She didn't make it," he said. "No," Sarah whispered. That's not possible. She wasn't even sick yet. We were going to fix it." The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, blood clot in the lung, triggered possibly by anesthesia prep, or stress, or bad luck. But none of that mattered to Sarah. What she remembered was standing in that cold hallway, holding the scarf her mother had taken off just before going in. She remembered thinking, "I made her do this." From that moment, Sarah stopped singing. Grief sat on her like wet wool, heavy, scratchy, impossible to shrug off. She finished high school numbly, turned down a college vocal scholarship, and moved to New Jersey after graduation, looking for something quieter. She took a job at the library. Books didn't ask questions. People didn't linger. The first time she felt the lump in her own throat, she was 23. It was small, no bigger than a pea. She noticed it while putting on her necklace one morning. Her fingers brushed against a little bump that hadn't been there before. Her first reaction wasn't fear. It was guilt. The memory of her mother, her voice, her death, the scarf, hit her all at once. She stood frozen in the mirror, fingers on the lump, her breath shallow. "No," she said aloud. "No doctors." She pulled open her closet and found one of her mother's old scarves. It was soft, worn thin, still carrying the faintest trace of lavender. She wrapped it around her neck, hiding the lump, and told herself it was just a precaution. Just until it went away. But it didn't. Over the next 6 months, the lump grew, slowly, almost politely. It never hurt. It didn't interfere with her daily life. And because it didn't demand attention, she didn't give it any. People started to notice the scarf. "Bit warm for that, isn't it?" a barista asked one spring morning. "I run cold," Sarah replied with a smile. An older woman at the library leaned in one day and whispered, "Darling, are you covering a hickey?" Sarah flushed crimson and walked away. She bought thicker scarves. Wool in the winter, cotton in the summer, turtlenecks, collars, layers upon layers until she became known, affectionately or otherwise, as the librarian with the scarf. It became her armor, her invisibility cloak, her barrier. As the years passed, Sarah's world shrank. She avoided photos, skipped weddings, refused video calls. Even in sweltering July, she kept her neck covered. The lump grew, sometimes barely perceptibly, sometimes in spurts that made her dizzy. But still, she didn't see a doctor. Part of her believed she didn't deserve help. She had forced her mother to face treatment and watched her die. How could she now go running to medicine for her own salvation? Besides, she thought, "I'm not in pain. I'm still breathing. I can handle this." But she wasn't breathing well. Not really. She woke up gasping sometimes, her throat tight. She avoided sleeping flat. Swallowing pills became a chore. Her voice changed, so slowly she almost didn't notice. Less resonance, less strength. She couldn't sing even if she'd wanted to. And still, she said nothing. The shame had fused into her identity, a quiet parasite that fed on her silence. Each year that passed, the scarf tightened, not physically, but psychologically. It became her, until the day she collapsed, until the day her body made the choice she had refused to make for years. The days blurred together. Sarah's life had become a pattern, deliberate, quiet, and safely predictable. She arrived at the library each morning before it opened, unlocked the glass doors, turned on the lights in silence, and made herself a cup of weak coffee in the back room. The building, a modest two-story structure built in the 1950s, felt like a safe house from the world outside. Its creaky wooden floors and sun-faded shelves never judged her. Books never asked about the scarf. Dewey Decimal never cared how she looked. She spent hours shelving returns, repairing bindings, answering simple reference questions. Her coworkers were polite but distant. Over time, Sarah had trained them, without ever saying a word, that she preferred solitude. People respected boundaries when you made them clear. She became something of a ghost in her own workplace, reliable and quiet, always with a scarf tucked neatly around her throat. By now, she owned dozens. Winter scarves, lightweight summer scarves, infinity scarves, scarves with prints and scarves in solid colors. But no matter the fabric or pattern, each served the same purpose, to hide what was underneath. The swelling at her neck had become impossible to ignore, both in her body and in her reflection. She barely looked at herself in the mirror anymore. When she did, she only looked at her eyes. Her voice, once strong and warm, had thinned over time. It wasn't hoarse exactly, but flat, dehydrated, like a radio station just out of range. She avoided long conversations, avoided public speaking. Even answering the phone sometimes took effort, and when the library installed a new intercom system, she quietly asked to be exempt from using it. No one argued. Outside of work, Sarah's world was small. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, where the scent of detergent permanently filled the halls. She had no pets, no roommates, no regular guests. Her phone rarely rang. Social invitations had long stopped arriving, and she hadn't attended a family gathering in over 3 years. Most people assumed she simply preferred being alone. Only Sarah knew the truth. She was hiding. The physical symptoms had escalated. She woke up tired no matter how much she slept. She could no longer lie flat without feeling like someone was pressing a pillow over her mouth. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she woke gasping, throat clamped, heart pounding. She dismissed it as allergies, as poor posture, as anything but what it probably was. When a colleague once noticed her looking pale and asked, "Are you feeling okay?" Sarah forced a smile and said, "Just didn't sleep well." She'd learned to wear long sleeves and full collars, even when the temperatures climbed. She'd learned to keep a water bottle close by, because talking for more than a few minutes made her throat dry. She always had cough drops in her purse, just in case. She had mastered the art of appearing fine. One Tuesday afternoon, while helping a teenager locate a book on women in science, Sarah turned too quickly and felt a wave of dizziness roll over her. It passed in seconds, but left her disoriented. The girl looked at her, concerned. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Sarah nodded, steadying herself on the edge of a shelf. "Just stood up too fast." She laughed, but it sounded thin and wrong in her ears. She excused herself to the back room, splashed cold water on her face, and stared at her reflection in the staff bathroom mirror. The scarf was light gray, thin cotton, knotted loosely. She tugged it gently aside and saw the swelling. It wasn't a lump anymore. It was a mass, a presence, like something grafted onto her, a part of her that didn't belong and yet had claimed permanent residence. Her fingers hovered above it, then withdrew. She couldn't touch it, couldn't acknowledge it, not out loud, not even to herself. That evening, as she was closing the library, Micah appeared again. Same messy hair, same eager grin. He waved his summer reading log like a badge of honor. "I'm almost done with the whole list," he beamed. "Even the boring ones." Sarah chuckled softly. "I'm proud of you." He tilted his head and studied her. "Miss Bennett, can I ask something?" "Of course. Why do you wear scarves all the time? Even when it's hot?" Sarah froze for half a second. She hadn't expected the question from him, from a child of all people. Not with malice, Not even curiosity. Just genuine confusion, the kind that came from innocent minds. "I get cold easily," she said after a pause. "Thin blood, maybe." "Oh." He seemed to accept that, but then added, "It's just that sometimes I see you breathing like my grandpa does when he's sick. Like, short." Sarah's smile flickered. She bent down, looked him in the eye, and said, "You're very observant, Micah." "Is that bad?" he asked. "Not at all," she said. "It means you notice things that matter." He smiled again, satisfied, and ran off toward his dad waiting in the car. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table long after dinner, her scarf folded beside her like a sleeping animal. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, a stillness that didn't comfort her like it used to. She took out her laptop, her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed, swelling in neck plus shortness of breath plus hoarseness. Search results flooded the screen. Words like goiter, thyroid nodule, tracheal compression, surgery, biopsy, airway obstruction, medical diagrams, hospital sites, forums with terrified posts and desperate questions. Her hands trembled. She closed the browser, shut the laptop, and went to bed with her scarf still off, just for the night, she told herself. But in the morning, when the sunlight slipped through her curtains and landed on her pillow, she reached for the scarf again, almost reflexively. She tied it gently, adjusted it in the mirror, and looked away before she could catch a glimpse of what lay underneath. She wasn't ready, and maybe she thought she never would be. The heat wave arrived like a slow-moving disaster. By Thursday, Maplewood had become an oven. The local news warned people to stay indoors. Elderly residents were urged to visit cooling centers. Schools canceled outdoor activities. The air itself felt thick, syrupy, impossible to inhale without effort. Even the birds seemed quieter. Inside the library, the air conditioning fought a losing battle. The vents breathed lukewarm air, and the ceiling fans pushed it around like helpless hands. By noon, sweat clung to the backs of patrons' necks. People came in not for books but for relief. Mothers with toddlers, retirees with newspapers, teenagers with backpacks, and nowhere else to go. Sarah stood behind the circulation desk, her scarf damp against her skin. She had chosen one of her thinnest cotton scarves that morning, telling herself it would be fine. It wasn't. Every breath felt tight, shallow, as if the air had to squeeze through a narrow passage before it reached her lungs. She kept sipping water, trying to calm the subtle panic rising in her chest. She reminded herself of the same lie she'd repeated for years. "I'm okay. I've always been okay." Then, at 12:47 p.m., the lights flickered. A low murmur moved through the building. The ceiling fan slowed, stuttered, then stopped. The air conditioning died with a soft sigh. For 2 seconds, the library held its breath. Then the heat settled in like a predator. Patrons complained. A mother fanned her toddler with a book. Someone joked, "Well, guess we're reading in hell today." The staff debated closing early, but the manager was out sick and no one wanted to make the call. Sarah watched the thermostat rise, 78, 82, 85. The scarf pressed against her neck like a damp bandage. She tried to focus on her work. She stamped returns. She answered questions. She smiled when Micah walked in again, cheeks flushed from the heat. "You guys have power?" he asked. "Not today," Sarah said softly. "But we're still open for now." He grinned. "Cool. I like it better when it's quiet." Sarah tried to smile back, but her mouth felt dry. She swallowed, and it was harder than it should have been, like pushing a pill down without water. A tightness crawled up her throat. She turned away from the desk, pretending to search for something on a cart. Her heart beat faster. Not because of exertion, but fear. An old fear, one she had trained herself not to name. She reached up unconsciously and loosened the scarf a fraction. Her fingers brushed the swelling. A sudden rush of dizziness swept through her like a wave. Her vision narrowed, the edges darkening. The room tilted. She grabbed the edge of the desk. Not here. She forced herself upright and walked quickly toward the back hallway, where the staff bathroom was located. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her breathing made a faint, high-pitched sound, something between a whistle and a rasp. She tried to inhale slowly, to calm herself, but the air didn't come easily. It felt trapped somewhere above her chest. She turned into the hallway, and the world lurched again. For a moment she thought of her mother. Not the laughing version, not the singing one. The version in the hospital waiting room, pale and stubborn, scarf folded in her lap. The last time Sarah had seen her alive. Sarah's legs trembled. She reached the wall and pressed her palm against it. Her lungs burned. The sound in her throat grew louder, an unmistakable, terrifying rasp that she could no longer ignore. Someone down the hallway called her name. Sarah? She didn't respond. She couldn't. Speaking would have stolen the little air she still had. She pushed forward, desperate to reach the bathroom, desperate for privacy even now. But she only made it a few steps before her body betrayed her. Her knees buckled. She fell. The impact against the wooden floor knocked the air from her completely. She tried to inhale, but nothing happened. Her chest rose and fell in a frantic, useless motion. The rasp became a squeal. Her eyes widened as the panic hit full force. She couldn't breathe. Footsteps thundered toward her. Someone screamed. Books clattered as a cart toppled. Micah's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and frightened. "Miss Bennett!" Sarah's hands clawed at her scarf. She tugged it, not to remove it, but to loosen it, instinctively. Her fingers fumbled, weak, trembling. Black spots danced in her vision. A woman crouched beside her, shaking. "Oh my God, Sarah, can you hear me?" Sarah tried to nod. She tried to blink. The hallway blurred. Someone called 911. Another staff member, voice shaking, said, "She's turning blue." That was the moment, the exact moment, when Sarah realized the lie was over. She had convinced herself for 5 years that the worst thing that could happen was being seen. But the worst thing was this, dying in silence with her scarf still on. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but those minutes stretched like an eternity. Sarah lay on the floor, her body trembling, eyes wet with terror. The oxygen mask came first, then the blood pressure cuff, then the pulse oximeter. "Her SATs are low," one paramedic said, voice quick and urgent. 87, maybe lower." Another leaned closer, listening. "Stridor," he muttered. "She's got Stridor." The word landed like a sentence. They tried to ask questions. Sarah couldn't answer. Her throat was a prison. One paramedic reached toward her scarf. Sarah's eyes flashed with panic. Her hand weakly slapped at his wrist. "No," she tried to say, but it came out as a desperate wheeze. The paramedic hesitated. "Ma'am, we need to check your airway." Sarah shook her head, tears spilling out. She grabbed the scarf tighter, clinging to it like it was her last dignity. Even now, even with the world dimming, she couldn't let go. They loaded her onto a stretcher. The library staff stood back, stunned and helpless. Micah stood near the door, trembling. As they wheeled Sarah out into the sunlight, the heat hit like a wall. The scarf felt like fire. The oxygen mask fogged with every shaky breath. Inside the ambulance, the siren screamed. Sarah stared at the ceiling, her eyes unfocused. She heard voices, urgent and clipped. She felt hands adjusting straps, checking 4 lines. Her world narrowed to the simple act of trying to breathe. Then she heard a different voice. Calm, steady, older. "Sarah Bennett?" She turned her eyes slightly. A man in a white coat had stepped into the ambulance bay as they arrived at the urgent care center. Dr. James Alcott, the on-call physician, who had been alerted by the paramedics over radio. He climbed inside, his eyes scanning her face, the oxygen mask, the scarf. He spoke gently, but with authority. "Sarah, I'm Dr. Alcott. You're in trouble right now, but you're not alone." Sarah's eyes filled again. She tried to pull away, her body trembling, but she was too weak. Dr. Alcott leaned closer. He noticed the high-pitched sound every time she inhaled. Stridor, severe. He didn't waste time. "We need to see your neck," he said. Sarah shook her head violently, as much as she could. Tears spilled out. She tried to mouth words. "Please, don't." Dr. Alcott paused, and in that pause, he made a decision, not medical, but human. He softened his tone. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I want you to hear me. I have seen things that would surprise you. I've seen people walk in with half their face missing. I've seen scars and burns and injuries that would break most hearts." He held her gaze, and I have never once thought less of them. Sarah trembled, eyes darting away, ashamed even as she struggled for air. Dr. Alcott continued, voice low. "I know you're scared of being seen. I know you're ashamed, but I need you to answer one question for me." He waited until her eyes found his again. "Is protecting your secret worth your life?" The question hung in the small, cramped space of the ambulance, like a heavy curtain. Sarah's lips trembled. Her chest rose and fell in shallow panic. Her eyes squeezed shut, and a sound escaped her. Not a word, but a broken, surrendering sob. Then she nodded. Just once. Dr. Alcott reached for the knot of the scarf, slowly, like approaching a frightened animal. "Okay," he whispered. "Thank you. I promise you, I will not let anyone hurt you." He began to loosen it. The scarf came away in layers. First the knot, then the fold, then the final wrap that had rested against Sarah's skin for 5 years like a second collarbone. Dr. Alcott pulled it free with careful hands, and for a moment, the inside of the ambulance felt strangely quiet, like everyone had forgotten how to breathe. What was underneath stopped them all. It wasn't a lump. It was a massive, distorted swelling that rose from the base of Sarah's throat like something that didn't belong to the human body. The skin stretched over it was shiny, taut, almost translucent, and faint blue veins traced across the surface. It pulsed, subtly, rhythmically, as if it had its own heartbeat. One of the paramedics whispered, "Jesus." Dr. Alcott's eyes sharpened. He didn't look away. He leaned in, and his trained mind began working at full speed. The trachea, her airway, was visibly displaced, pushed far to the left. It was so dramatic it could be seen without touching her. Her breathing sounded like a storm trying to squeeze through a cracked door. He glanced at the monitor. Her oxygen saturation had dropped again. 85, then 83. Time was running out. "This is a massive multinodular goiter," he said quickly. "Severe tracheal compression." The paramedics nodded, recognizing the words but also sensing the reality. This was not a routine case. This was a disaster unfolding in real time. Dr. Alcott looked down at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, terrified, pleading, not just for air, but for mercy, for dignity, for a chance not to die with strangers staring at what she had hidden for so long. He squeezed her hand. "Sarah, listen to me," he said. "We need to get you to County General. They have a surgical team, and they can fix this. But your airway is unstable. You could stop breathing again." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She tried to nod, but her body was trembling too hard. Dr. Alcott raised his voice slightly. "Start high-flow oxygen. 4-dexamethasone. Now, call for emergency transport. I want surgical on standby, ENT and endocrine surgery." A paramedic moved fast, injecting the steroid. Another adjusted the oxygen mask, trying to maximize every ounce of air. Dr. Alcott's mind raced through the nightmare scenario. If her airway collapsed completely, intubation would be nearly impossible. The goiter had squeezed her trachea down to a narrow slit. If she lost muscle tone under sedation, the airway could collapse like wet paper. "Can't intubate. Can't ventilate." The phrase chilled him. It was every anesthesiologist's worst fear, every emergency physician's nightmare. He turned to the paramedic closest to him. "Get the airway kit ready," he said. "We may need a surgical airway. Cricothyrotomy equipment, now." Sarah heard the words. She didn't know the details, but she understood the meaning. Something was very wrong. Her breath hitched again. Her oxygen saturation dipped. 80, 79. She began to gasp, her chest heaving, her throat whistling in a shrill, terrifying pitch. Her lips turned faintly blue. "Sarah," Dr. Alcott said urgently, "stay with me. Look at me." But Sarah's eyes rolled slightly, unfocused. Panic and lack of oxygen were pulling her away. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The vehicle lurched forward. The siren wailed into the heat. They drove. For the first minute, Sarah fought to breathe. For the second, she started losing the fight. Her head lolled to one side. Her eyelids fluttered. Her fingers loosened around Dr. Alcott's hand. Then the sound stopped. No more rasp. No more wheeze. Just silence. For half a second, it almost seemed like she had finally relaxed. And then the monitor screamed. "Her CTs are dropping fast," a paramedic shouted. "She's not breathing," Dr. Alcott snapped into motion. "Bag her, now," he ordered. They placed the mask. They squeezed the bag valve, forcing air into her lungs, but the chest barely rose. The air met resistance. The trachea was collapsing. The goiter was crushing the pathway shut. "Not moving air," the paramedic said, voice rising with panic. "Not moving air." Dr. Alcott tried repositioning her head, but the mass made it difficult. Her neck couldn't extend normally. Her body was too compromised. Her oxygen saturation plunged. 70, 65, 60. Sarah's face turned ashen. Her eyes fluttered open for a final moment, wide and terrified. She looked directly at Dr. Alcott, and in her gaze was something that broke him. Not just fear, regret, A silent, desperate question. Is this how I die? Dr. Alcott made the decision. Prep for cricothyrotomy, he said, voice sharp. Now. We don't have time, one paramedic froze. In the ambulance? Unless you want her dead in the next 30 seconds, Dr. Alcott snapped. Then softer, do it. They moved with frantic precision. Gloves, antiseptic, a scalpel, a small tube. Sarah's skin was warm, slick with sweat. The goiter distorted everything. But Dr. Alcott found the landmark, just below the Adam's apple, the cricothyroid membrane. He had done this before, but never like this. Never with a neck so deformed. Never with the airway so compromised. He murmured, almost to himself, "Hold on, Sarah." Then he cut. A quick incision, a blunt dissection, a careful push. The tube slid into place. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. And then, air. Her chest rose. The oxygen saturation climbed slowly, painfully. 45, 50, 58, 65. Sarah's eyes fluttered again. Her body jerked with a sudden inhale as the air finally entered. A sound escaped her. Not a word, not a cry, but something between a gasp and a sob. Alive. A paramedic exhaled shakily. Holy. Dr. Alcott didn't respond. He kept his hands steady on the tube, eyes locked on the monitor, forcing himself not to feel the tremor in his own chest. They weren't safe yet, but she wasn't dead. The ambulance sped toward County General, sirens screaming, tires slicing through the shimmering heat. Inside, Sarah lay still, her breathing now coming through the small tube in her neck. The scarf sat folded on the bench beside her like a discarded skin, and for the first time in 5 years, Sarah Bennett had nothing left to hide behind. Only the raw, terrifying truth. The ambulance doors slid open at County General with the same brutal efficiency that had carried Sarah into the world of the living just moments before. Stretchers, 4 lines, oxygen tanks, and the urgent shuffle of hospital staff formed a blur around her. The temporary airway, a cricothyrotomy tube placed skillfully in the field, was keeping her alive, but only just. She was not out of danger. Not by a long shot. Dr. James Alcott was already briefing the waiting surgical team as they wheeled her through the emergency bay. The fluorescent lights reflected off her pale skin, damp with sweat, eyes fluttering under exhaustion. Nurses murmured as they adjusted her monitors. The beep of the oxygen saturation creeping upwards provided the only real hope, though it was still far too low for comfort. Get her to surgical ICU prep, Alcott said, pointing toward an open bay. We have a compromised airway, tracheal compression, and a massive multinodular goiter. NT, endocrine, both on standby? 2 surgeons nodded sharply, already reviewing the notes on the tablet. Alcott looked down at Sarah's face, then toward the anesthesiology team waiting in scrubs and gloves. Let's move, he said. Inside the small, sterile room, the air smelled of antiseptic and urgency. Dr. Patricia Chin, the anesthesiologist, was already finalizing the airway management plan. She had been briefed en route. Awake intubation might no longer be necessary, since the tube was placed, but the situation remained precarious. The trachea was unstable, the airway was narrowed and unnervingly unpredictable. We'll maintain her current airway for now, Dr. Chin said, her voice calm but focused. We cannot risk losing it. Once she's under deeper control, we'll secure a more definitive airway, with fiber optic guidance. The plan moved forward with swift precision. Every surgeon and nurse knew their role. Time was measured in heartbeats, and every second counted. The first challenge was sedation. Too much, and the airway could collapse completely. Too little, and the patient would panic, making intubation impossible. Dr. Chin administered carefully titrated sedatives and local anesthetics to keep Sarah comfortable and responsive, but calm. As the fiber optic device was prepared, a hush fell. The screen flickered to life, a slender tube with a camera at its tip. Gently, under Dr. Chin's expert hands, it was guided through the temporary opening in her neck and worked downward into the airway. The monitor showed a tight passage, one that looked like an overflattened straw, barely letting light through. Dr. Chin didn't flinch. Steady, steady, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Within minutes, the endotracheal tube was placed into the trachea, navigating the compression and deviation with as much precision as the human body allowed. A sense of controlled relief spread through the room. The airway was secure. For now, you did well, Alcott told Sarah quietly. Just keep fighting. Her eyelids were heavy, her response sluggish but present. Not long now, and she would be under anesthesia for the definitive surgery. The next hours were a blur of preparation, 4 lines, imaging scans, blood work, and last-minute consultations. The surgical team examined every angle of the massive goiter pressing against Sarah's airway and vital structures. Radiology confirmed what they suspected. The goiter was enormous, with multiple nodules, and deeply entangled in the soft tissues of the neck. Dr. Marcus Sanderson, the lead surgeon, stood over the imaging screen in quiet concentration. "This isn't a standard thyroidectomy," he said. "There's significant retrosternal extension. We may need partial sternal split to access the inferior portions safely." A partial sternal split meant dividing part of the sternum, the breastbone, to reach the goiter hidden beneath. It added complexity, risk, and time to an already delicate operation, but everyone agreed it had to be done. In the operating room, the tension was palpable. Monitors beeped, anesthesia flowed through carefully placed lines, and every hand moved with practiced precision. Dr. Sanderson moved with a surgeon's quiet confidence, skilled, unhurried, decisive. The incision began just above the existing airway tube, along a natural neck crease. The skin was opened, and the dissection began. Immediately the magnitude of the task became clear. The goiter was not a single mass, it was a cluster of nodules, like a grotesque fruit growing behind the thyroid capsule, each one pressing and pulling on nearby structures. It occupied space it should never have touched. It stretched toward the chest, wrapping around muscles, brushing veins and arteries like fingers around a rope. Every step forward required delicate reverence. One wrong move and vital blood vessels could be torn. Nerves critical for speech and swallowing lay hidden beneath the distorted anatomy. The team moved steadily, carefully. Hours passed like minutes. Alcott and Chin stayed side by side with Sanderson, ready for any sudden change. Sweat gathered under surgical caps, masks stayed in place, and every movement remained precise. At one point, the goiter resisted. A nodule clung stubbornly near the carotid artery, a lifeline that could not be compromised. "We'll isolate and retract," Sanderson said calmly. "Gentle, controlled movements. No force." The assistants obliged, giving the surgeon space. In that moment, the operating room was not a battlefield. It was a ballet, a coordinated, silent exchange of skill and intent. The goiter finally yielded. The surgeons breathed a quiet, collective sigh. Then came the final phase, working around the trachea itself. The walls of the airway showed signs of chronic pressure. Some sections appeared soft, fragile, almost like tissue paper. It was a risky area, and the team handled it with additional precision. "Weakened cartilage," one nurse whispered. "Tracheomalacia," a shudder passed through the room, not of fear, but awareness. It explained why her airway had been so unstable in the field, and why every breath had felt like a battle. They reinforced what they could, stabilized what they could, and assured one another that nothing more could be done in that moment. The last tie was cut. The goiter was free. Dr. Sanderson lifted it, a massive collection of distorted tissue, weighing far more than the thyroid gland was ever meant to weigh. Nurses measured and documented, whispering in quiet awe. 1.2 kilograms. Healthcare professionals rarely spoke in pounds or kilograms when describing organs or tumors, but this one defied convention. It was enormous. The operating room fell briefly silent as the goiter was set aside. In its place, the neck, once distorted and compressed, now revealed its true anatomy. The trachea, thin, soft, vulnerable, lay exposed. Dr. Chin and her team worked quickly to confirm the stability of the secure airway, their movements smooth but urgent. The last phase of the surgery was underway. Every nerve, every vessel, every millimeter of soft tissue was treated with reverence. The recurrent laryngeal nerves, the ones responsible for voice and airway protection, were identified and gently preserved. One wrong cut here, and Sarah could lose her voice forever. Sanity in the operating room depended not on silence, but on trust. Each surgeon communicated with unspoken understandings, eyes always moving, always calculating. "We're almost there," Sanderson said almost to himself. The endocrine team took over the closure of the surgical site. Layers of muscle, fascia, and finally skin were brought together like the careful folding of a delicate origami. The last stitch was placed with the precision of a watchmaker. The monitors remained stable. The anesthesia team continued to keep her comfortable. Dr. Chin exhaled slowly, though she never relaxed her vigilance. If the first part of the operation had been about removal, this phase was about repair, about restoring what disease had taken and ensuring the body could function again without the oppressive weight that had nearly strangled it. At last, the operating lights dimmed. Sanderson stepped back, leaning slightly on the edge of the table as if absorbing the moment. It had been a long, demanding procedure, but one they had approached with patience and reverence. "She's stable," he finally said. "Airway is secure," Dr. Chin added, fatigue barely touching her voice. Alcott, who had been by Sarah's side through the entire ordeal, exhaled with an odd mixture of relief and exhaustion. They transferred her to the surgical ICU for close observation. There, her survival would continue, not as a crisis, but as a process. Hours later, in a quiet corner of the hospital coffee lounge, Dr. Alcott and Dr. Chin finally allowed themselves to sit. They didn't speak about the technicalities anymore. They didn't have to. A long silence stretched between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of what they had just lived through. "Will she recover fully?" Alcott asked, not looking up from his coffee. Chin stared into her own cup, eyes thoughtful. "Physically," she said, "yes, most likely. We still need to monitor for tracheomalacia consequences and watch how her airway behaves." Alcott nodded and sipped his coffee. "But emotionally," he added quietly. Chin looked at him then, with a seriousness that matched his own. "That," she said, "is up to her." And it was true. In the ICU, Sarah lay with her eyes closed, the bandages beneath her chin neat and clean. A monitor beeped steadily by her side. The goiter was gone. The airway was holding. Her body had survived the surgical storm. But now came the calm, the part where survival turned into living again. At the foot of her bed sat the folded scarf she had worn for years, now a testament to both fear and resilience. It had protected her from exposure, but it had also hidden her from life. The nurse on duty checked her vitals and smiled softly when Sarah's eyelids fluttered open. Her gaze moved slowly around the room, and when she saw the scarf resting there, something complex flickered in her eyes. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was the beginning of understanding. Dr. Sanderson came in soon after, offering the kind of reassuring professional smile that carried both confidence and empathy. "Your body did very well," he told her. "You made it through the surgery beautifully." Sarah blinked up at him, her voice weak but present. "How?" Dr. Sanderson gestured to her throat. "We took out the mass that was compressing your airway. We took care of your trachea. You're alive, Sarah." She looked down at the scarf again, its fabric soft, familiar, suddenly heavy with meaning. Sarah woke to a beeping rhythm she didn't recognize at first. It was steady, persistent, not frightening, just present, like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. She blinked slowly, as if surfacing from a deep dream, eyes sensitive to the soft blue glow of the ICU lights. The scent of antiseptic and warmth around her felt different from the cold uncertainty of the operating room. Here, there was safety, even if it came wrapped in tubes, wires, and machines. Her throat felt heavy, tight in places she couldn't quite pinpoint. At first, she couldn't remember where she was. Her forehead creased, trying to pull together threads of awareness. Then the memory came in pieces. The heat, the collapse, the ambulance, the tunnel of urgency, the voice of Dr. Alcott, the suffocating weight under her scarf. And then, nothing. Just hazy darkness. Her eyes flicked left, then right, each turn sending a mild throb of discomfort through her neck and jaw. Her hand, weak and unsteady, rose toward her throat instinctively, stopping before it could touch the bandages. There was a foreignness there, a sense that something important had changed. Her fingers hovered just above the soft cotton folds of her scarf, folded neatly on the bedside table, no longer wrapped around her neck like armor. "Good morning," came a voice soft and unhurried. It was a woman in scrubs, pushing a small clipboard. Her expression was gentle but not patronizing, an unfamiliar kind of professional warmth. "Welcome back," she said. "We've been watching you rest." Sarah's throat felt thick, and speech would have been a challenge, but she managed a weak nod. Her voice, if she tried to speak, would probably come out as a whisper. The nurse didn't push. "Right now," the nurse continued, "your airway is stable. The surgery went well. But you're in the ICU so we can monitor how your breathing adjusts without the goiter compressing your trachea." Another pause. "I'm Nurse Patel. If you need anything, just squeeze gently on that button." The nurse pointed to a small handheld device next to her bed. Sarah's eyes followed the gesture, then returned to the folded scarf. Her fingers curled into the sheets, emotion tightening her chest in an unexpected way, something more complex than fear. Something like sorrow, or maybe unresolved longing. It took a long moment before she even recognized what she felt. Not physical pain, but emotional weight, a gravity in her heart that made her breathe slowly, deliberately, as though testing the air just to reassure herself that she still could. The door opened quietly, and Dr. Alcott stepped in. He didn't announce himself with urgency or alarms. Instead, he approached with a calm familiarity, like someone entering a room he had visited many times before, only this time the purpose wasn't crisis, it was conversation. "Morning, Sarah," he said, pulling a chair beside her bed. His tone was steady, neither clinical nor casual. He had that rare ability to make a complex moment feel simple and real. "How are you feeling?" Sarah tried to focus on his face, on his eyes. They held concern, but also something softer, more human. She attempted a smile, thin but genuine, and managed a slight nod. "You're doing very well," he continued. "You made it through an extremely difficult surgery. The team is very pleased with your progress so far." His words were factual, but his eyes held a kind of warmth that spoke louder than medical reassurance. Sarah felt her throat tighten in a different way, not like the physical constriction she'd known for years, but like the emotional strain of a memory rising into focus. "I remember you," she said, her voice thin, fragile like glass. "From the ambulance." Alcott's expression softened when he heard her speak. "Yes," he said. "You gave us permission to help you. That was the turning point." Sarah looked down, eyes drifting toward the scarf on the bedside table. She didn't reach for it, not yet. Her gaze lingered on the familiar folds of cloth, the fabric that had been her companion for years and her shackle for just as long. After a moment of silence, she whispered again, this time more forcefully, more intent, words she had never spoken aloud for years. "I don't want to die." Her voice, delicate and strained, carried more weight than she expected. It wasn't a declaration, it was a confession. Alcott nodded, his face thoughtful. "You were very close to it," he said. "Your airway was severely compromised. If the goiter had progressed just a little more, we might not be having this conversation." Sarah exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling with a fragility that was both terrifying and comforting. She was alive. That in itself felt monumental. "It wasn't the heat," she said, as though clarifying something, "or even the collapse. It was—" She hesitated, emotion shaking her voice. "All of it." Alcott listened with a respectful stillness, the kind that doesn't interrupt or correct, but allows the speaker to find themselves in their own words. "Tell me what you felt when you woke up this morning," he said softly. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if reaching inward. The ICU sounds, monitors beeping, soft footsteps in the hall, faded into a low hum. What rose to the surface was something deeper, a flicker of her mother's voice, clear and sweet, like a song she had almost forgotten entirely. "You sounded like her," she whispered, "in the hospital, the way you talked to me." Her voice trailed off, and moisture gathered in her eyes. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was deeper, an emotional convergence of fear, memory, regret, and something that felt like honesty. "I thought," she continued, voice trembling, "that if I just covered myself long enough, if nobody saw, maybe I could pretend nothing was wrong. Maybe I could fix it on my own." Alcott's gaze never wavered. He didn't speak, but his eyes gave her permission to continue. "I was wrong," she admitted, "about everything." Her tears fell quietly, not dramatic, not loud, just real. For the first time in years her defenses were down, and what poured out wasn't physical pain. It was the release of decades worth of hidden grief, fear, and unresolved self-blame. She had buried her pain under scarves, under silence, under avoidance. She had lived in the shadow of her mother's death, interpreting it as her fault, and now, here in a quiet ICU room, with tubes and monitors, and a man who had literally pulled her back from the brink, she was facing herself. She didn't yet know forgiveness, but she knew truth, and sometimes truth was the first step toward healing. The next days in ICU were a slow unraveling of more than just physical healing. Medical staff tracked her oxygen levels as her airway adjusted without the pressure of the goiter. The tracheomalacia meant careful monitoring, Sometimes her airway walls were too soft, too pliable, but each sunrise found them placing less reliance on machines and more on natural breath. Nurses checked her charts, noted small improvements, and offered gentle smiles of encouragement. But as the body healed, the mind pulled its own heavy shroud closer. Therapy sessions began, short, cautious, emotionally loaded. Dr. Elizabeth Graves, a psychologist specializing in trauma and chronic illness, entered the room with the measured grace of someone who knew the fragility of a newly awakened psyche. "Good morning, Sarah," she said in her warm, neutral tone, professional but empathetic. "Today I'd like to talk about your memories, not the medical details, but what it was like to carry this alone for so long." Sarah shifted in her bed, pulling the blanket up over her knees. Her eyes flicked to the folded scarf on the table, then away. "That scarf," she said softly, "was my shield. And maybe it was my prison too, Doctor." Graves didn't jump in. She waited. "Your body was crying for help for years," the therapist continued, "and each time you ignored it, something else got heavier inside you. Not just the physical mass, but the emotional burden of fear, shame, and loss." Shame, that word hit her harder than expected. It was not embarrassment, not caution. It was something denser, like a weight that dulled joy, muted connection, and turned every kind gesture into something to be feared, avoided, or dismissed. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling a memory wash over her, of her mother in the hospital waiting room, of the panic in her own chest when she had thought she'd pushed her mother into that cold corridor, of the long nights spent unraveling that single moment until it consumed every good thing she ever knew. "I thought I'd hurt her," she said finally, her voice thick. "I thought if I let people see me, they'd watch me die. Just like," her voice cracked, "just like I watched her." Dr. Graves nodded. "That's a heavy burden to carry alone." It was more than heavy. It was a weight that had stretched into every year that followed. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" the therapist asked gently. Sarah didn't answer at once. She studied her hands, thin, frail now, but alive. "I thought if I ignored it, it would go away," she replied. "But mostly, I was afraid of what people would think. I didn't want pity. I didn't want questions. I didn't want to be that woman with the weird neck thing." Dr. Graves studied her with compassion, not judgment. "Sometimes," she said, "what we fear others will see is just the last thing we want to see in ourselves." That sentence lingered in the room like a quiet echo. They talked for a long while, about her mother, about her silence, about the pile of unread books on her shelf at home, about how bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to live despite it. It was exhausting, deeper than any surgery she'd undergone. But something changed that afternoon. Something subtle and almost invisible, yet undeniable. When Dr. Graves left, Sarah reached across the bedside table and unfolded the scarf. It wasn't just fabric anymore. It was a chapter, closed but not forgotten. The next morning, Dr. Alcott visited again, carrying a small cup of hospital-grade herbal tea. "Good morning, Sarah," he said. "How are you today?" She sat up a little straighter. Her eyes were clear, reflective, but no longer haunted. "I thought about something," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "About everything that happened, and what I thought it meant." He nodded, inviting her to continue. "I realized that hiding didn't protect me," she said. "It trapped me. And it didn't just keep others from seeing me. It kept me from seeing myself." His face softened with respect, not just as a physician, but as someone who had witnessed a profound human awakening. "You survived the physical," he said. "Now you're facing the emotional. That's the harder part." She smiled, an honest, unguarded smile. "Maybe," she replied. "But I think I'm done hiding." Days later, she agreed to let her first visitor into the ICU room, Micah. The boy stood awkwardly near the door, clutching a crumpled drawing he'd made for her. In it she wore no scarf, just her face, smiling under a bright sun. "I drew this for you," he said softly. Sarah took it with a trembling smile. "It's beautiful," she said, realizing she meant more than just the picture. And for the first time in years, that felt like truth. The transition from ICU to a regular surgical ward was a quiet milestone, but to Sarah, it felt like stepping from a cave into sunlight. The machines were fewer now, the beeping less urgent. She could hear birds outside the window, real ones, not the synthetic rhythm of monitors. She'd slept without the breathing tube for the first time the night before. Her voice, still raspy and raw, was returning in fragments, whispers more than words, but hers again. The room was bright with late-morning sun. Someone, probably a nurse, had opened the blinds slightly, enough to cast soft shadows across her bed. Sarah sat up with minimal help now, her neck still wrapped in protective gauze, though the swelling had started to go down. The physical pain was manageable. It was the unfamiliar stillness inside her that caught her off guard. For years she had lived with pressure, literal and metaphorical. The goiter had pressed against her windpipe, but the emotional weight had squeezed her far more tightly. Without that constant internal friction, her body felt foreign, light even. The scarf lay neatly folded on her side table, as always. Only now it felt like a relic, not a shield. It had protected her, yes, but at a cost she hadn't understood until it was nearly too late. "You look stronger today," said Nurse Patel as she entered the room with a clipboard and her usual gentle smile. Sarah nodded slightly, her voice rough but audible. "I feel stronger. Good. Dr. Alcott wants to get you started on some vocal therapy soon. Just light exercises, nothing too strenuous. The pressure on your vocal cords from the goiter was significant, but you've been very lucky. No nerve damage, which is rare with a mass that size." Sarah swallowed carefully. The muscles in her neck were still tight but moving freely. Her voice would come back, like the rest of her, in time. When Dr. Graves visited later that afternoon, Sarah was waiting. She had a blanket wrapped around her lap and a notebook on her tray table. "I wanted to write something," Sarah said before the therapist could speak. "Not a diary, just thoughts. What I remember, what I forgot, what I told myself to survive." Graves nodded with approval. "That's a good sign. Writing helps organize the emotional debris, helps us name what we couldn't bear to think about before." Sarah paused, her fingers resting on the pen. "It also helps me believe that it really happened. That I didn't make it all up." "You didn't," Graves said simply. They talked more, about identity, about forgiveness, about the difference between guilt and grief. Sarah spoke about her mother in full sentences now, not as a whisper of pain, but as a person, flawed, loving, human. She spoke about the small rituals she used to cope, rearranging books in alphabetical order at the library, brewing the same tea every night, folding her scarf the same exact way. "Those things gave me control," Sarah said, eyes distant. "Even if they were illusions, they were survival tools," Graves replied. "We don't discard them, we thank them. And then we ask ourselves if we still need them." Sarah turned her gaze toward the scarf again. It was just fabric now, no longer armor. In the days that followed, she was transferred to a physical therapy suite where she learned to stretch her neck, build back muscle tone, and manage the fatigue that came from years of under-oxygenation. The therapists were kind, efficient, encouraging. They didn't ask about the scarf. They didn't need to. Micah visited again, this time with his father. He gave her a new drawing, this one of a tree with bright green leaves and a small bench under it. "That's you sitting on the bench," he said proudly. "Reading a book." Sarah smiled, her heart softening in a way she hadn't expected. "What book?" Micah grinned. "Whatever book you want. You're the librarian." She held the drawing to her chest, a tear slipping down her cheek, not of sadness, but of connection. She'd spent so long believing she was invisible, and here was a child who saw her for exactly what she was. One afternoon, Dr. Alcott stopped by with an envelope. "It's from the hospital's patient outreach team," he said. "They asked if you'd be willing to speak eventually, about your story, about fear, about healing. No pressure." Sarah held the envelope in both hands. She didn't open it right away. She didn't need to. "I'll think about it," she said. "But maybe it's time someone heard the truth." Alcott nodded. "Whenever you're ready." On the final morning of her hospital stay, Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her recovery room. She was wearing a soft cotton dress with a modest neckline, no scarf. The bandages had been removed, leaving behind a thin line across her neck. A scar, yes, but not a shameful one. It was evidence. Evidence that she had survived, that she had chosen to live, that she had faced her fear and walked through it. She picked up the scarf one last time and ran her fingers over the fabric. It was soft, familiar. It held years of breath, sweat, and memory. Then, with quiet finality, she placed it in a donation bag. Let someone else wear it now. Someone who needed warmth, not hiding. Outside the hospital doors, the world was exactly as it had been before. Cars passing, birds calling, people walking with coffee cups and backpacks. But to Sarah, it felt new. Not overwhelming, but possible. She took her first step into the sunlight. It didn't burn. It didn't blind her. It welcomed her. A week later, Sarah returned to the library, not as an employee yet, but as a visitor. The staff greeted her with hesitant smiles, unsure of what to say. But Micah saw her first, running over with a hug that surprised them both. "You came back." Sarah knelt down, careful of her healing muscles. "I told you I'd see you again. Are you better now?" She smiled. "I'm working on it." She wandered through the aisles for a while, touching book spines, listening to the quiet that once felt like a cage and now sounded like music. Her heart beat steady. Her breath was hers again. Before she left, she filled out a volunteer form. "I want to help kids," she told the front desk. "Story time, reading aloud, that kind of thing." The staff nodded, touched. "We'd love that." As she walked out, she caught her reflection in the glass doors. Same face, new life. 2 months after her surgery, Sarah stood behind a small podium in a modest auditorium at County General Hospital. The folding chairs were filled, not with doctors or reporters, but with people like her, patients, caregivers, survivors. Some had surgical scars just visible beneath shirt collars. Others wore expressions of weariness or hope. A few had tears in their eyes before she even spoke. She took a quiet breath, her own breath, unencumbered, and adjusted the microphone slightly. The thin white scar across her neck was fully healed, though still visible. She had chosen not to cover it. Not today. Not ever again. "I used to believe that silence could protect me," she began. Her voice was clear now, not the whisper it had been in the ICU, but something stronger, that if I just kept quiet, kept my head down, wrapped a scarf around my shame, maybe the world would look away. She paused, eyes scanning the audience. But the truth is, silence didn't protect me. It isolated me. It made me smaller than I was, and it nearly cost me my life. There were nods. A few hands gripped the arms of chairs. Her words didn't need dramatic flair. They resonated in their simplicity. "I lived with a goiter for 5 years. It grew slowly, then dangerously. And I did nothing, not because I didn't know it was serious, but because I was ashamed. I thought people would stare. I thought they'd whisper behind my back. I thought I wasn't worthy of care." She swallowed, her throat still delicate but steady. "I was wrong, not just medically, emotionally, spiritually. I had let fear become my decision maker. I had let shame drive the bus. I thought I was being strong, but really, I was just hiding." The room remained quiet, the kind of silence that listens. One day my body collapsed, but my mind, my heart, they had collapsed long before. I was just too afraid to admit it. It took the kindness of strangers, of doctors, nurses, and one very persistent boy with a drawing to help me see that survival isn't enough. We have to live. Sarah let the moment hang. She wasn't in a rush. This wasn't about performance. It was about truth. I stand here today not because I beat something. This isn't a victory speech. This is a thank you to every person who reminded me that I mattered when I didn't believe it myself. She held up a small object, a folded piece of soft fabric. "This scarf was with me for 5 years. I wore it through winters and summers, in the library, at home, even to sleep. It was my mask, my shield, my hiding place." She unfolded it slowly and placed it on the podium. "But it wasn't who I am. It never was." A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. It wasn't weakness, it was memory. "I don't know what you're hiding," she said, eyes sweeping the crowd, "or what you've been afraid to face. But I promise you, there is life on the other side of fear. There is breath beyond shame. There is healing, even for the most buried wounds." There was a silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Of understanding, of recognition, of human connection. "Maybe you've been carrying your own version of this scarf," she continued. "Maybe it's time to let it go." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was warm, sustained, deep. After the event, people came up one by one, not to congratulate her but to share. One woman whispered, "I've been hiding my mastectomy scar for 8 years. Another man with tears in his beard said, "I haven't told anyone I have Parkinson's." Sarah didn't offer advice. She didn't need to. She listened. That night she sat on the small porch of her apartment, a cup of tea steaming in her hands. The city was quiet, the streetlights humming gently. On her lap was a notebook, the one she'd started in the hospital. Its pages were filled now, not just with trauma, but with reflections, poetry, and tiny promises to herself. Tomorrow, She would return to the library, not as a visitor, but as a reader at Children's Story Hour. Her voice wasn't perfect yet, but it was hers, and that was enough. As she looked up at the moon, soft and unashamed in the open sky, Sarah thought of her mother. Not the hospital bed, not the fear, but the woman who used to sing lullabies at night, who once told her, "The world can be scary, but never so scary that you should disappear from it." She smiled. For the first time in years, Sarah Bennett was not disappearing. She was arriving.